Well, of course, it has one of the most recognisable corporate images in the world.
Any blacksmith could fix it.
The first £100 car.
They got a character. They got a lovely little shape to them.
Tends to wander about on the road, particularly once you get above about 30 miles an hour.
It reminds me of my youth.
The car you've always promised yourself.
Ford Motor Company began because a Michigan's farmer's son fell off a horse, basically, in 1872. Henry Ford was 9. He decided there was a much better way to move around the countryside than riding on horses, and when his father was taking him into town, he saw a traction engine by the side of the road and thought, this is it, I want to become an engineer. Well, Henry's aim as a farmer's son was to take labour off the farm. Horses, he thought, were too slow and cumbersome and needed feeding, and they got ill and they died. He wanted a source of power that would end all that on the farm, and so he decided that he was going to make a motor car. In 1896, Henry Ford built himself a little car, called it a quadricycle, and it ran.
It looked like a buggy, only it had no shafts for a horse to be harnessed to. The horsepower was going to come from a gasoline engine he'd made himself. The first car of the new little company was called the Model A. It had a 2-cylinder, 8-horsepower engine, and it could go 30 miles an hour. It sold for $850, a lot of money in those days, and its owners were chiefly in the upper brackets.
But he had this dream of a car for the great multitude. So he got a team of very skilled, dedicated engineers around him, and in 1908, they built what Henry Ford regarded as the universal car, the Model T.
The nation took the Model T to its heart. People called it a flivver, made jokes about it, loved it. They said it could go anywhere except in society.
There was a little man, his name was Henry Ford. He took a bit of rubber and a little bit of board, a little drop of petrol and an old tin can. He shoved the lot together and the darn thing ran. Perhaps there's a little truth in that. This is a 1915 Model T Ford, built at Manchester and assembled from parts sent in from America in knockdown crates. The engineering aspects are very, very simple. It's a straightforward sire valve engine. Any blacksmith could fix it. There are no instruments at all. On the early Model Ts, there was just a speedometer, but on the later ones, Henry managed without that. So you listen and go by sound and feel as much as anything. So if you're good at feeling what the car's telling you, the Model T will behave very well.
Henry Ford wanted to build the Model T in larger and larger numbers because he'd seen that by building more and more of the same thing, he could cut the price. He and his companions went to Chicago one day, and they went to a meat processing factory where they were slaughtering pigs, and they were doing this by hanging the pigs on a moving conveyor. And Henry was impressed by this. He said, why don't we adapt this for producing cars? And they tried dragging a car through the factory and building it up as it went so that each worker had one allotted task. And in 1913, they installed the world's first moving production line in their Detroit factory for building motor cars. And from then on, the Model T poured out of the factory by the thousand. And by the early 20s, he was building 2 million a year.
I got involved with Model Ts at the ripe old age of 15 when my cousin was working then for a local Ford dealer. He'd been out demonstrating a 57 Prefect to an old farmer, and he happened to mention during the test drive that parts of his previous purchase from that firm were still in the farm loft. We returned a few days later with sufficient equipment, thinking we were going to find a complete car. Sadly, there was only the body in the chicken loft and a few other parts left lying about that the scrapman couldn't move. We were given them. In those days, that was the going rate. Back in the 60s, Ts were not really valuable. Well, the Model T must have been Henry's big one. He called it his masterpiece. It was the greatest seller and it put Ford on the map worldwide. Everybody knew Henry Ford and his product.
I suppose the most graphic description of Henry Ford that anybody ever made was to call him genius ignoramus. He was a Michigan farmer's son with all the narrowness of view that implied, but he had a breadth of vision that was quite remarkable. Here was a man who, if he turned up at Ford Motor Company nowadays and was asked to sit a simple written examination, would be thrown out and not given a job because he couldn't even spell the word model in Model T. But despite all that, became a billionaire, the first billionaire of the motor industry, and who gave the world transportation on a scale that he had never seen before.
In May 1927, the 15 millionth Model T came out of the plant. And the assembly line closed down forever on the world's most famous car.
In October 1931, Henry Ford said to his designers, "Create me a small car for Europe." By February 1932, they had running prototypes on display at motor shows in Europe. It was done that quickly. The Model Y, which was the result, was a brilliant piece of styling, and it gave Ford instant market success.
The peculiarities about the Model Y really are its braking and steering, which are both fairly dodgy. Steering is very wandery. It tends to wander about on the road, particularly once you get above about 30 miles an hour, and that's made worse by the skinny tyres. Braking, it has rod-operated brakes, not hydraulic brakes like on more modern cars. And there's 4 different length steel rods connected to the brakes, and consequently the brakes will actually come on at different times. So you lock one wheel and then another one. So in the wet, it's particularly hairy. I find it fascinating to realise that people like a family of 4 would load the car up and maybe go from London to the Midlands for a week's holiday in it. And it's quite an impressive feat really in a car like this.
Other makers like Morris and Singer brought out rival cars with similar styling and more modern mechanical features. Ford was in a corner because it's now looked expensive against these rivals. So in 1935, they cut the price dramatically. They cut the dealer's margins to nearly nothing. They cut their own profit margin to about £5 a car. They brought out a car at £100. Nobody could match it. It's the only £100 saloon car there has ever been. It was a marvellous success, and it gave back Ford the market share it was losing.
This is the Ford Poplar 103E, built from 53 to 59, and although 20 years down the road, it followed on from the Model Y, and not a lot else really changed. It still has its cable brakes, still has its funny way of wandering about the road, and in the wet they can be quite fun, you know.
Braking must be smooth, like this. Did you notice the driver's hands up? Watch again.
Another characteristic of these cars is they have a vacuum wiper system. That runs off the engine. The air from the engine runs the wipers. The more you use the engine, the less the wipers get. So in theory, you're going up a hill, you're trying to use your engine, it's pouring down a rain, and your wipers stop. You have to let your foot off, let your wipers clear your screen, and away you go again. A lot of people behind you moan a little bit, but we get there.
When you get into your Ford, whether it be the Popular, the Deluxe, or the V8, and drive up hills, over bad surfaces, round acute bends, or wherever else the whim takes you, the easy and trouble-free run is just accepted, because you know your Ford will never let you down.
thing I really love about these cars is they got a character. They got a lovely little shape to them. It's just fun to drive. I found this one in a hedge in Downham Market, Norfolk. We built it myself, and I love it. It's a passion.
The next advantage is on hills. The Popular is climbing Fingalbridge Bridle Path, which is normally only used by cars in special trials. Gear trouble on this hill would be trouble indeed, but the Popular takes the bends and surface like a young thoroughbred.
Ford in the 50s made a major change of direction. They opened their own engineering centre. This was actually in Birmingham, and they developed a new small car there, which was a modern small car, the first modern small car they'd actually had since the 1930s. It came out in 1959 and it caused a sensation.
The original sales brochure said, "A new shape, jet sleek from headlight to tail. It's a dream of a car that you learn to love for the thrill of sheer pleasure. In you get, key start, into first, second, crisp change, third gear near 60 and snap it into top. And away, exciting. Trees flashing by, a grey ribbon of road, discover a zest you'd forgotten. Driving is fun. Settle back and work through that 4-speed magic box. Coax every ounce from the long striding engine. Feel safe as a rock as you corner on rails. Fingertip steering, brakes that take note of the touch of a toe. And relish a styling that's really practical." The Ford Anglia 105E, when it was launched in late 1959, was a really revolutionary car. The main impact that it had on people was the fact that the window was sloping in the opposite direction from what it did on a conventional car, and it also had these fins on the back. Under the skin, mechanically, it was also almost completely new, having a new overhead valve, 997cc's engine, a new gearbox which had 4 speeds, whereas the previous models that had side valve engines and 3-speed gearboxes. The initial model, which came out in 1959, was a saloon, and following from there, Ford later brought out an estate car based on the same mechanical running gear, but with more useful load area at the back. They had cars which would appeal then to fleet buyers, as well as to private individuals. People who wanted to use a car as a family car, people who wanted to use a car in their business, people who wanted to use a car on the weekend to go off on a fishing trip or whatever with the estate car. And they seem to fill various slots in the market from the one basic conception of 1959. I've got it. See you up there. Some special models were also made by companies such as the ice cream van, which was made by Martin Walter, based on the van, which was cut down and with a fiberglass top added.
Thank you. Come on, cheer yourself up, man. Make never happen.
There are a couple of interesting features of the ice cream van, in as much as there wasn't sufficient headroom inside for a person to stand up if they stood on the floor. So there was a removable panel in the floor of the van so that the person could take this piece of wood out and actually stand down on the road while serving ice cream from the vehicle. Happy birthday!
Happy birthday! Happy birthday!
Apart from being a small car to bring them into the next decade, it also paved the way for larger cars, which were also to use more modern mechanical items.
The car that really put Ford on the family car map in the 60s was the Cortina. It set Ford off on a new road because it offered family car room at economy car prices.
The Cortina was launched in 1962, so obviously it was developed in the late 50s. At that time, Ford had two ranges of car. They had the small Prefect models and the larger Consul Zephyr Zodiac range. Now what they needed was a smaller car to fit in between the two, and that's where the Cortina was destined to go.
We're at Cortina, Italy, famed as a winter sports resort, where 19 world champion race and rally drivers are being feted for having accumulated more than 200 wins in 26 countries driving the Ford Cortina, named the International Car of the Year. When the world's finest drivers get together, something exciting is bound to happen. And in this case, it's the discovery of an exciting new sport called autobobbing. Here's what the famed bobsled run looks like from the driver's seat of the world-famous Cortina. Championship sleds travel the course at about 50 miles per hour, and the Cortina exceeds that speed while taking some of the turns with only 6 inches of clearance.
It started off as the Mark I. That carried on for 4 years. That was a very square, standard design, conventional transmission layout. It caught on, the public liked it. It was a very reasonable price. It was just above the smaller Minis and other such cars of the time, and it did sell very well. The Mark I sold over 1 million items, almost half of which were exported to countries all around the world.
I particularly like my Mark I Cortina because it reminds me of my youth. I've had all the Mark Cortinas, but I like the Mark I best because of the shape and its design.
This 1600E Mark II was bought originally in 1969 by a member of the family, and we've had it ever since. And it was one of the first family saloons that had the touch of executive about it. The wood trim and the steering wheel and the sporty lines. And I've liked them ever since.
The Cortina, right from the start, was the new family car. The brochures talked about the mould-breaking car. It was obviously something that somebody was supposed to have to be, again, very up-to-date. It's most obviously signified by the marketing, particularly of the Mark II Cortina, when they got their confidence. And you get, in the late 60s, the design features that were current of the black and white, the op art, are actually reflected in the adverts and in the brochures. And so you get girls wearing black and white checked hats, you get car boots full of black and white balls, you get this traditional family car again being presented as something exciting.
Then in 1970, October, the Mark III Cortina was launched. Now this was a completely new car, everything on it was new. It was called the metric car, as we've now gone into the metric era. It had a very American styling. Coke bottle styling was one term used to describe it. It certainly had Mustang looks about it. It had a whole new range of engines, up to the 2000cc, making it a much faster car.
I like the Mark III Cortina basically because of the style, the comfort. It was designed an American style, and I've always liked the Mustang, so this style is the next best thing.
The Mark IV Cortina was launched in October 1976. It was certainly the reps car of the 70s and 80s, as well as the family car, which it always had been. And it brought total production of Cortinas to about 4.2 million. The Cortina was often called the Dagenham dustbin, and this was obviously an insult to the car, and which was probably a result of its success, because it's a quirk of human nature that they love to knock something that is successful and see it fall in even the smallest way.
The paradox is that the Cortina became successful because in one sense it was ultra safe and ultra conservative mechanically, but was actually quite exciting compared with other cars visually. Obviously the Capri, when that was launched, the car you've always promised yourself, was again something of the slightly dream element about it.
This is the new Ford Capri. A genuine fastback that's fun to drive, but doesn't cost a fortune. A car that you'd take for a sleek two-seater, but in fact will hold 4 adult-size adults in comfort.
With the Sierra, when it was launched, it was obviously based on a prototype. And again, the marketing of that was rather strange, that you got these surreal scenes to suggest the future, to suggest that in a Ford, you were forward-looking and you were very much up to date.
I suppose you could say that the Ford Motor Company, certainly up until the end of the Cortina era, was still very much recognisably the company that had been founded by Henry Ford. Then Ford decided it was going to change its image. This really came about with new models like the front-wheel drive Escort, the Fiesta and the Sierra, which changed away from the traditional boxy Fords into a sleeker, more upmarket view. It's not always something I think that Ford has been able to carry off as well as it might, and it's sometimes been misunderstood for trying to jump too far from where it was before. But I think as long as Ford is controlled by product enthusiasts, it will always be successful. Sometimes it's had the, what one might call the bean counters in charge. But there was a lovely story about when old Henry Ford was in charge in the 1920s, and his son Edsel complained that the accounts department was too cramped. Henry went into the factory and looked at the office where the accounts department was. He said, "I agree with you," and he sacked them all. He said, "Now there's plenty of room." And I think as long as Ford keeps its product at the top of the tree, it'll have no problems, because it's still got that vision of providing acceptable transport for the great multitude.